Picture this. You are standing in a damp, freezing dungeon in a 13th century citadel.
Oh, and it's a medieval prison, so it is just absolute miserable.
Right, exactly. It is pitch black, except maybe for like a tiny sliver of light filtering through this high stone grate.
It's incredibly bleak.
Totally. And in the corner, there is a man. He has been stripped of absolutely everything. I mean, no books, no paper, no pen, no ink.
They basically took away his entire life.
They did. The authorities took it all, thinking they could finally, once and for all, silence him. But if you look closely, you will see him hunched over whatever scraps of material he can find, stubbornly scratching out a massive, multi-volume intellectual manifesto.
Using literal garbage to write a masterpiece.
Yes, and he's doing it using nothing but leftover pieces of charcoal.
The sheer defiance of that image is just incredible to me. It perfectly captures a mind that simply refused to be contained by stone walls.
Or by the intellectual authorities of his entire era, for that matter. Welcome to our deep dive. Today we are taking a stack of fascinating historical sources and exploring the life, the works, and the fiercely independent thought of Taqi al-Din Abu al-Abbas Ahmad ibn Abd al-Halim.
That is quite the name. But to history, and to us today, he is universally known as Ibn Taymiyyah.
Right, Ibn Taymiyyah, born in 1263, he lived right in the middle of what we might call the chaotic pre-Renaissance period of Islam.
And we're talking about an era defined by the apocalyptic terror of the Mongol invasions. It was not a peaceful time to be a scholar.
Not at all. And our mission in this deep dive is to unpack how this single thinker, a man who frankly absolutely despised the labels of theologian or philosopher, acted as both.
He basically beat them at their own game.
He really did. He systematically dismantled the intellectual establishment of his day, advocating for a radical, uncompromising return to the original teachings of the Qur'an and the Sunnah, the traditions of the Prophet.
What makes his story so compelling for a modern audience is his absolute intolerance for overcomplication.
He had zero patience for it.
None. He looked at the scholars of his time and saw people lost in Greek logic and abstract theory, debating these invisible atoms and metaphysical concepts, while their civilization was literally burning to the ground around them.
So if you, the listener, have ever sat in a meeting or a classroom and felt completely overwhelmed by complex jargon or overly theoretical models or academic gatekeeping that just seems designed to make you feel stupid.
Oh, we have all been there.
Right. Well, Ibn Taymiyyah is the historical rebel you need to meet. He was the ultimate anti-jargon advocate. He firmly believed that knowledge was entirely useless without practical, virtuous action. Okay, let's unpack this.
I'm ready.
Before we can even begin to understand his philosophy, we have to understand the world that forged him. Because, you don't become a guy who writes massive encyclopedias with charcoal in a dungeon by having a quiet, easy life.
No, definitely not. His worldview was forged in the fires of immense geopolitical trauma. That's right. What's fascinating here is how his early life sets the stage for everything. The texts point out that Ibn Taymiyyah was born in a city called Haran in 1263.
And Haran was near Damascus, right?
Yes. Historically, it was famous for its Hanbalite school of thought, which was a very traditional, text-focused school of Islamic jurisprudence. But Haran was also known as a place where ancient philosophers and Sabians once lived.
So it had this weird mix of strict tradition and ancient philosophical echoes floating around.
Exactly. But the defining moment of his life happened when he was just 7 years old, in 1269. The Mongols ravaged his city.
And when we read the word ravaged in these historical texts, it is so easy to just gloss over it, like, oh, another medieval battle.
Right, it loses its impact.
But we aren't talking about a simple change of local government or a border dispute. We're talking about the end of the world as they knew it.
The Mongol invasions were a civilizational trauma on a scale that is honestly hard for us to comprehend today.
I mean, they wiped entire cities off the map.
They did. Just a decade earlier, in 1258, the Mongols had sacked Baghdad, and Baghdad was the cultural, scientific, and intellectual heart of the entire Islamic world.
The stories from that sack are horrifying.
They really are. The accounts from that time describe the Tigris River running black with the ink of millions of destroyed books from the Grand Library.
Oh, wow.
And then running red with the blood of the scholars and citizens. So, when the Mongol war machine reached Haran in 1269, his father, Abd al-Halim, who was a respected scholar himself, had absolutely no choice.
You had to get them out of there.
He had to pack up the entire family and flee to Damascus just to survive.
Imagine being a 7-year-old boy, just leaving your home, running for your life from one of the most fearsome military forces in human history. That has to leave a permanent mark on your psyche.
Absolutely.
It has to shape how you view stability, unity, and ultimately, the very purpose of learning. Because if your books can just be burned and your city destroyed, what is the point of abstract philosophy?
It shaped everything he ever wrote or did from that point on.
Yeah.
He didn't view learning as a luxury or like a parlor trick for rich elites. In Damascus, he threw himself into an incredibly rigorous education.
He was a prodigy, basically.
He was. The sources tell us he studied the Arabic grammar of Sibawahi under a master named Ali ibn Abdal Qawi.
Okay.
And he studied hadith, which are the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, with more than 200 different sheikhs.
Wait, 200 teachers?
More than 200, yeah.
That alone shows a staggering level of dedication. And there is a detail from the sources that I found absolutely incredible, especially given our modern stereotypes about medieval history.
All about his teachers.
Yeah. In his own book, The Arba'un, where he catalogs all these teachers, he specifically highlights that 4 of his teachers were women.
Yes. What's fascinating here is that it pushes back against so many assumptions people have about medieval Islamic scholarship.
Exactly. It wasn't just this exclusive boys' club.
No, he was drawing knowledge from every credible traditional source he could find, regardless of gender, as long as they possessed the authentic chain of transmission.
He just wanted the pure, authentic knowledge.
Right. He was building an encyclopedic knowledge of the texts. But here is the crucial pivot. He wasn't just a bookworm. He wasn't just sitting in a library memorizing grammar rules while the world burned.
Right, because usually when we picture philosophers or theologians, we picture quiet academics in ivory towers, surrounded by dust, debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
Very passive.
But Ibn Taymiyyah is out there acting like a medieval action hero intellectual. The text literally describes him as a mujahid, a fighter.
He literally took up the sword. During his stay in Syria from 1292 to 1305, he personally fought against the Tartars and other groups allied with the Mongol forces.
He was actually on the battlefield.
He was. In 1302, he was present at the Battle of Shaqab near Damascus. And he didn't just fight as a foot soldier. He used his immense scholarly reputation to exert serious political pressure. Well, he met with the Caliph and the Mamluk Sultan, Muhammad ibn Qalawun. The Mamluks were the military caste that ruled Egypt and the Levant at the time.
And they were kind of the last line of defense, right?
Exactly. They were the only real bulwark against the Mongols. Ibn Taymiyyah actively urged the Sultan and the nobles to join the Holy War to defend their lands.
He was rallying the troops.
And then, in 1304, he actually led an army himself against the people of Jabal Khusrawan in Syria and handed them a crushing defeat.
Wait. How does a scholar of Arabic grammar and traditional texts end up leading a cavalry charge? What is the mechanism there? Did the generals just hand over the reins because he's smart?
It comes down to moral authority in a time of absolute crisis. When the political and military leadership is wavering and the population is just terrified, someone who speaks with absolute, uncompromising moral clarity becomes a center of gravity.
People just naturally follow that confidence.
Right. People rallied behind him because he wasn't just theorizing about courage. He was on the front lines. He saw the political dissensions in the Muslim world, all these tiny, hyper-specific doctrinal differences.
The academic squabbling.
Yes. He didn't see them as interesting academic debates. He saw them as a fatal existential weakness.
This squabbling was making them easy prey for the Mongols.
Precisely. He believed that theology, philosophy, and jurisprudence had evolved into highly complex theoretical systems. But the result was that they had fractured the community into a dozen different competing schools of thought.
Everyone arguing, no one fighting the actual enemy.
So he emerged as a mujtahid.
And just to clarify for our listeners, a mujtahid is someone who is qualified to form an independent legal opinion, right? Bypassing the established schools.
Correct. It means someone who exerts the intellectual effort to derive legal rulings directly from the source texts, rather than just blindly following the rulings of previous generations of scholars.
So he was bypassing the bureaucracy of the religion?
Exactly. His entire platform was a radical reset. He basically said, we have to go back to the original sources.
Back to the basics. The Qur'an and the Sunnah. The sources say he wanted to follow the Salaf al-Salihun, the early pious Muslims.
Right, and the term Salaf simply means predecessors or ancestors. Ibn Taymiyyah argued that the first 3 generations of Muslims understood the faith perfectly without needing Greek logic or complex theology to explain it to them.
They just lived it.
Yes. And I should note here, while his movement is often referred to historically as the Salafi movement, It's really crucial for us to separate his 13th century intellectual project from modern political movements that might use the same name today.
Oh, absolutely. The context is entirely different.
In his context, it was a pure epistemological argument. Drop the imported Greek philosophy, drop the medieval innovations, and go back to the foundational texts.
Because he was so loud and so uncompromising about this, the religious establishment of his day absolutely hated him. I mean, he was threatening their jobs, their prestige, their entire intellectual framework.
He was a massive threat to the status quo.
So he spent a huge portion of his life in prison.
He was a constant thorn in their side. He faced massive legal debates, such as one in Cairo in 1305, against a prominent Indian scholar named Sheikh Safi al-Din al-Hindi.
They were constantly dragging him into court.
Always. And it was often the other scholars, the religious elite, who pushed the political rulers to lock him up. They were just infuriated by his fatwas, his legal decisions, and his treatises, which were systematically dismantling their life's work.
So they would complain to the authorities and get him locked up. He was in prison multiple times in different cities.
Yes, repeatedly.
Yeah.
Ultimately, he was interned in the citadel of Damascus in July 1326. But even in prison, he didn't stop.
He just kept going.
The text notes, he wrote books and pamphlets defending his views. It is said he prepared a massive commentary on the Qur'an in 40 volumes called Al-Bar al-Muhit while locked up.
40 volumes from a dungeon. That is insane productivity.
That is when his enemies truly panicked. They realized that physical confinement wasn't stopping his ideas from spreading.
The books were still getting out.
Right, so they escalated. They had him stripped of his books, his paper, his pen, and his ink.
Which brings us back to that opening image, the charcoal. He kept writing with whatever he could find on whatever surfaces were available until he died in that citadel in September 1328.
A really tragic but powerful end.
The authorities must have thought that his death in prison would be the end of it. Like, oh, he will just fade into obscurity as a disgraced rebel. But they severely miscalculated how much the public loved him.
They vastly underestimated it. At his funeral, the historical accounts say more than 200,000 men and women flooded the streets of Damascus.
200,000 people in a medieval city.
The military had to be called in just to guard the massive crowd and maintain order.
My favorite detail from the sources is that out of his massive list of antagonists and rival scholars, only 3 of his enemies stayed away from the funeral.
And not out of protest either.
Right. They didn't stay away out of protest. They hid in their houses because they were terrified. The massive crowd would stone them to death.
It is a stunning testament to the immense influence he had on the common people. The academic elites might have hated him, but the public revered him.
Because he was authentic.
Exactly. Because he didn't just preach from an ivory tower, he lived his philosophy. The ultimate takeaway for anyone looking at his life is that knowledge is not just a passive acquisition of facts. Knowledge is defined by how you respond to the crises of your time.
Knowledge requires action. So with that intense, action-oriented background in mind, let's look at who he targeted first. Because he believed survival required unity and practical action, he turned his sights on the theologians of his day, a group known as the Mutakalamun.
They were his prime target.
He felt they were tearing the community apart with abstract Greek-inspired arguments, and he went after them with everything he had.
And to understand his anger, we really need to understand what Kalam, or Islamic theology, had actually become by the 13th century.
Okay, set the stage for us. What was the state of theology?
Well, over the preceding centuries, the Islamic world had absorbed the lands of the former Byzantine and Persian empires. They encountered established Christian and Jewish theological traditions, and more importantly, they translated massive amounts of ancient Greek philosophy.
We're talking Aristotle, Plato, Plotinus.
Exactly. So you have all these ancient philosophical tools floating around the intellectual sphere. The early Islamic scholars began using these Greek logical tools, things like syllogisms and dialectics, to defend Islamic beliefs against philosophical attacks.
So they were trying to fight fire with fire.
Right, and they used it to try and systematically explain the nature of God. This defensive systematic theology became known as Kalam.
Ibn Taymiyyah looked at this highly complex system and basically said, this is an innovation, this is bid'ah.
Yes.
He argued that the prophet didn't use Greek logic to explain God, the early companions didn't use it, so why on earth are we forcing our religion into an Aristotelian mold?
He believed that Islamic society was being corrupted from within by several forces. The sources actually list them out.
What were the big ones?
Sufism, that had strayed into mysticism, pantheism, outright philosophy. superstitious beliefs like paying undue homage to the tombs of saints, and above all, theology or Kalam. He openly stated that theology and philosophy had absolutely no place in Islam.
He wasn't subtle about his disdain either. In his writings, he loved citing earlier foundational scholars who felt the exact same way. There is a quote from Imam Shafi that the text highlights, and it is beautifully brutal.
Oh, the shoe-beating quote.
Yes, tell them the shoe-beating quote.
He cited Imam Shafi as saying that theologians should be beaten with shoes and palm branches and then paraded through the city so that people may know the terrible consequence of the study of theology.
Beaten with shoes. That is some serious, tangible medieval academic beef. I mean, you don't see that on Twitter today.
No, they took it very seriously. He also cited other heavyweights, like Imam Ahmad and Abu Yusuf, who warned that seeking knowledge through scholastic theology would eventually turn a person into an atheist.
So they genuinely believed this stuff was intellectually and spiritually toxic.
Completely toxic. He attacked specific groups that had formed over the centuries, like the Jahmites, the Mutazilites, and even the later Asherites.
And these were theological sects that had heavily integrated that rationalist Greek thought into their reading of Scripture, right?
Yes. Ibn Taymiyyah pointed out that to make their theories work, they had invented a massive vocabulary of terms that simply did not exist in the Prophet's time.
The jargon. We are talking about words like jawahir, which translates to atoms or substances, and arad, which means accidents or temporary qualities.
Right, and we're going to dig deeply into the bizarre physics of that later, but his main point to these scholars was, why are you using a foreign imported vocabulary to explain the creator of the universe?
Like, why do you need Aristotle's dictionary to understand God?
Exactly. This raises an important question about how language inherently shapes our belief. Ibn Taymiyyah argued that when you force God into Greek philosophical categories designed by pagans who didn't even believe in a personal creator, you end up distorting who God actually is.
It warps the whole concept.
To illustrate how dangerous this was, he often pointed to the origins of this movement, specifically a man named Jad ibn Dirham.
Okay, the story of Jad ibn Dirham is incredibly intense. The sources tell this incredibly dramatic anecdote about how Jad's foray into theology actually got him killed.
It is a dark piece of history.
And I think this is a good moment to clarify something for you, the listener. We are about to discuss some pretty violent medieval history and some very intense religious disputes. As we always do on this deep dive, our goal is to objectively report what the historical sources say to help us understand Ibn Taymiyyah's worldview.
Right, we're just looking at the mechanics of these historical debates.
Exactly. We are certainly not taking a side on the religious validity of these medieval sects, nor are we endorsing the extreme political violence of the 8th century.
Right.
We're just exploring the history to see how it shaped the philosophy.
That is a very helpful frame because the history of these debates is undeniably brutal. So, Jad ibn Dirham lived in the early 8th century. He was one of the very first to introduce these rationalist theological arguments into Islamic discourse.
What was his controversial argument?
Specifically, he used Greek-style logic to argue that God could not possibly have taken Abraham as a friend, nor could God have spoken directly to Moses.
Wait, why would he argue that? The texts literally say God did those things, like word for word.
Because to Jad, friendship and speech implied human-like qualities. Friendship implies a mutual relationship, a change in emotional state. Speech implies vocal cords, sound waves operating in time.
Oh, I see.
According to the Greek philosophical definition of a perfect, unchanging, eternal God, Aristotle's prime mover, God cannot undergo change or have localized interactions. Therefore, Jad concluded, the text must be a metaphor. It cannot be literally true.
Well, the political authorities at the time saw this as a massive, dangerous heresy. The story goes that the governor of Wasit, a man named Khalid ibn Abdullah, was delivering a sermon on the pulpit, the minbar, on the day of the Eid sacrifice.
A very public, important holiday.
Very public. He addresses the massive crowd in the mosque and says, "O man, offer your sacrifice to God. Surely I am offering my victim in the person of Jad, who says that God did not take Abraham as his friend, nor did he speak to Moses. God is far above what Jad attributes to him."
And then following that proclamation, Khalid steps down from the pulpit, walks over to where Jad is being held, and beheads him right there in front of the congregation.
Wait, he stepped off the pulpit and beheaded him himself?
Yes, it is an unbelievable escalation of a theological debate.
That is just shocking. But Ibn Taymiyyah uses this gruesome story to make a point, doesn't he?
He does. He uses it to show that from the very beginning, the introduction of this Greek-style theology was rejected by the traditionalists, and it brought chaos to the community.
Right. He traced the intellectual rot back to Jod and to another early figure named Jam ibn Safwan.
Ibn Taymiyyah is setting up a historical narrative. He is saying, look at the destruction this methodology causes. But, as many modern historians have pointed out, there is a brilliant, glaring paradox in Ibn Taymiyyah's life work.
Okay, I think I know where you were going with this. He writes hundreds of books arguing about theology to prove that theology is bad.
Exactly.
He is essentially using theology to argue against theology.
It's a paradox he was entirely aware of, though. He refused to call himself a theologian, but he had to act as a master theologian to dismantle their arguments.
So he had to learn their game to beat them.
Think of it like a cybersecurity expert or a master hacker. You cannot destroy a complex computer virus just by ignoring it and reading poetry. You have to understand the code perfectly, better than the people who wrote it, so you can break into the system and shut it down from the inside.
That is a great analogy.
Ibn Taymiyyah had to master Aristotelian logic and Islamic Kalam so he can meticulously take their house apart brick by brick.
Okay, let's look at how he actually hacked their system when it came to the nature of God. What was his core argument against their logic?
His core argument was that applying this restrictive human logic to God actually strips God of his divine attributes.
Oh, so?
The philosophers and the theologians who followed them were obsessed with the idea of a simple, perfectly unified God. In Greek metaphysics, perfection means simplicity, having no parts.
Because if you have parts, something had to put those parts together, which means you aren't the ultimate creator. Something else is bigger than you.
Exactly the logic they used. So they thought that if you say God has knowledge, power, and life, you are implying that God is a composite being made up of multiple distinct attributes.
Like pieces of a pie.
Right. To protect this philosophical concept of God's unity, groups like the Jamites and Mutazilites started denying the attributes mentioned in the texts. They would say God is eternal, but he exists without distinct attributes.
To an average person, that just sounds like absolute nonsense.
Ibn Taymiyyah thought it was worse than nonsense. He thought it was functionally atheism disguised as piety.
Wow.
He said this logical gymnastics leads to an absurd situation where you are worshiping a God who lives without life, is powerful without power, and knows without knowledge.
That doesn't even mean anything.
Exactly. He argued that you cannot separate an attribute from the object it belongs to. The text's note, he used the example of a moving white object.
Okay, walk me through that.
Whenever an attribute is attached to a locus, an object, it's part of that reality. A white moving thing moves with its whiteness. You cannot logically strip the whiteness away and say the object still exists in the exact same way.
Right. He pointed out that the Qur'an and Sunnah abound with clear, direct statements that God is associated with his attributes. God speaks, God wills, God loves, God gets angry, and God is pleased.
These are active relational attributes. They aren't passive.
So Ibn Taymiyyah is saying, stop trying to protect God with your fragile Greek logic. God doesn't need your protection. Just read the text. The text says God has knowledge, so God has knowledge. Full stop.
But by taking this hardline stance, by insisting that the text absolutely should not be explained away as elaborate metaphors, Ibn Taymiyyah walked right into a massive intellectual trap set by his enemies.
They spun it against him.
They did. He was accused of the opposite extreme, anthropomorphism.
Anthropomorphism. Just to define that, it's the concept of making God human-like or giving God a physical, fleshy body. And here is where the history gets really, really interesting, because we enter the realm of what is essentially a 14th century fake news viral campaign designed to destroy his reputation.
This is one of the wildest parts of his story. The critics looked at Ibn Taymiyyah and argued, okay, if you completely refuse to interpret the text metaphorically, and the text says God has hands or a face, or that God settles on his throne, then you must believe God has a physical body just like a human.
The philosophers had very specific terms for this too, didn't they?
They did. They argued that if God sits on a throne, he is possessed of spatial character, which in Arabic is tahayyuz. It means taking up physical space.
Okay, tahayyuz.
And if he takes up space, he is subject to division, inquism. Basically, if God sits on a chair, God must have a physical bottom, and therefore God is a physical object made of parts that can be physically divided.
Which goes back to the parts argument, so his enemies used these philosophical deductions to brand him a literal heretic.
And the most famous, enduring example of this smear campaign comes from the travel writings of Ibn Battuta.
Ibn Battuta is legendary. I mean, he is one of the most famous travelers and chroniclers in world history. He's often compared to Marco Polo for the Islamic world. His accounts were widely read and trusted by everyone.
Very trusted. And in his writings, he gives a very vivid, supposed eyewitness account of Ibn Taymiyyah in Damascus.
What does he say happened?
In the account, Ibn Battuta claims he was present in the Great Mosque in Damascus, watching Ibn Taymiyyah give the Friday sermon from the pulpit. According to the story, Ibn Taymiyyah is preaching about a specific tradition that says God descends to the lowest heaven during the last third of the night.
And to illustrate his point, Ibn Battuta claims Ibn Taymiyyah said to the crowd, "Verily, God descends to the sky over our world in the same way as I make this descent." And then Ibn Taymiyyah physically stepped down one step of the pulpit.
In the context of Islamic theology, that is textbook undeniable anthropomorphism.
You are equating God's descent to a human leg stepping down a wooden stair.
It is comparing the mechanics of God's actions directly to the physical mechanics of human movement.
And according to Ibn Battuta's dramatic story, this physical demonstration sparked a massive riot right there in the mosque.
Oh, a total brawl.
A Maliki jurist who was present objected loudly, and then Ibn Taymiyyah's supporters violently attacked the jurist. The text says they beat him severely with their fists and their shoes, knocking his turban off and exposing his silken cap.
It is a phenomenal piece of storytelling. It has drama, it has physical action, it perfectly confirms the worst accusations of Ibn Taymiyyah's enemies.
There is just one problem.
Right. As modern historical analysis has shown, it is completely, verifiably fake.
It is a chronological impossibility. I love this part of the deep dive. When historians actually bothered to check the dates, the whole story collapses.
Because Ibn Battuta was meticulous about dates in his travel log.
Right. His own records show that he arrived in Damascus on August 23rd, 1326.
But the state records show that Ibn Taymiyyah had already been arrested and thrown into the dungeon in the citadel in early July 1326.
That is more than a month before Ibn Battuta even set foot in the city.
And Ibn Taymiyyah never came out of that prison before he died 2 years later.
So it is physically impossible for Ibn Battuta to have seen him give a public sermon on the pulpit. The story was concocted, likely fed to Ibn Battuta by Ibn Taymiyyah's enemies in Damascus.
And it was so skillfully told that it got recorded as historical fact for centuries.
It functions exactly like a deepfake video or a completely out-of-context tweet going viral today.
The narrative was just too good for his enemies to check, so it became his defining legacy in many circles.
Yeah.
People still repeat that story today to discredit him.
So if he didn't actually believe God physically stepped down a ladder like a human, what did he actually believe about these descriptions of God?
He positioned himself exactly in the middle of two extremes. On one side, you had the rationalist theologians who completely stripped God of attributes, a concept called tatil.
Okay, tatil.
On the other side, you had the anthropomorphists who compared God to humans, tamthil. Ibn Taymiyyah utterly rejected both.
He didn't want either extreme.
No, he said the only safe, rational path was to accept the Quranic descriptions of God bila kaif.
Bila kaif. That is a crucial phrase. It translates to without asking how.
Without asking how. He argued the human language is inherently limited and God is infinite. We should say of God what God has said of himself without drawing analogy to human bodies, without altering the text to mean something else, and without stripping away the meaning entirely.
Let the text be the text.
Right. He believed that if the text says God settles on the throne, then God settles on the throne as it befits his majesty, without any resemblance to how a human sits on a chair.
If the text says God has a hand, you say, I affirm that God has a hand, but I have absolutely no idea what the modality of that is. It definitely isn't a human hand made of flesh and bone with fingernails, but it also isn't just a metaphor for power.
You accept the reality of the word, but you refuse to project human physical constraints onto it.
He championed the idea that the early generations, the companions of the prophet who lived alongside him, had a much better, purer understanding of God than later philosophers who tried to map God onto an Aristotelian grid.
They didn't feel the need to dissect the mechanics of God.
There are two great takeaways for you listening here. One is highly practical. Always check the timestamps and dates on viral claims.
Yes, please.
Whether it's an explosive video on your social media feed today or a dramatic anecdote in a 700-year-old travel journal, the mechanics of misinformation haven't changed.
Not at all.
And two, sometimes the most radical, fiercely independent position isn't on the extremes. Sometimes it is stubbornly holding the middle ground, refusing to let other people's theoretical frameworks define your reality.
That stubborn refusal to use their frameworks leads perfectly into his next major intellectual campaign.
Oh, this is the big one.
Because Ibn Taymiyyah realized that he couldn't just argue about the results of the theology, he had to destroy the tools they were using to build those results. He had to pull the logic out by its roots.
He had to go after Aristotelian logic itself. And in the medieval intellectual world, Aristotle was considered the first teacher.
He was untouchable.
His system of logic was the absolute gold standard for how human beings were supposed to attain truth. To question it was like questioning mathematics.
But Ibn Taymiyyah writes massive treatises, specifically the Kitab al-Rad al-Mantatiqin, which translates to the refutation of the logicians, to completely demolish it.
Okay, let's really unpack this. How does Aristotelian logic fundamentally work? And how did Ibn Taymiyyah attack it?
Aristotelian logic, as utilized by the Islamic scholars of his day, rested on two main pillars to gain knowledge. The first pillar is the definition, or had.
Had.
This is how you understand individual concepts. The second pillar is the syllogism, or qiyas. This is how you combine concepts to reach judgments or conclusions.
And Ibn Taymiyyah attacks both of these.
Relentlessly. He argues they are not only flawed, but entirely unnecessary for human understanding.
Let's start with the first pillar, definition. The logicians claim that you cannot truly understand a concept unless you have a strict logical definition for it.
Right. And this definition is usually made up of a genus and a differentia.
Break that down for us.
The classic example is defining a human being as a rational animal. Animal is the broader category, the genus. Rational is the specific quality that makes us different from a dog or a horse, the differentia.
Okay, makes sense on paper. But Ibn Taymiyyah looks at this requirement and says, this is semantic nonsense.
His arguments against definition are brilliant in their simplicity. First, he points out a massive epistemological flaw. A definition is just a statement made by the definer. It's just a string of words.
Sure.
How do you know the words in the definition are true? If a philosopher gives you a definition, you either understand the words they are using already or you don't. If you don't know what the words mean, the definition doesn't help you at all.
Let me try to put this into practice. If I don't know what a human is, and you define a human as a rational animal, well, if I don't know what rational means, now I need a definition for rational.
Exactly.
And then I might need a definition for the words used in that definition. The text notes that Ibn Taymiyyah pointed out, this leads to either a circle, dar, where definitions just refer back to each other.
Like defining a word with the same word.
Right, or an endless chain, tasalsul, both of which make it logically impossible to ever actually reach a foundational understanding.
It creates a closed loop of language that never touches reality. Furthermore, he pointed out the empirical failure of definitions in the real world.
How so?
He told the scholars to just look around. No one can even agree on the logical definition of basic things. There is no universally agreed upon philosophical definition of a man or the sun.
Right, if you ask 10 philosophers, you get 10 definitions.
Exactly. You have entirely contradictory definitions depending on whether you ask a doctor, a grammarian, or a philosopher. Yet, despite this lack of a perfect definition, everyday people still clearly know what a man is and what the sun is.
We don't need the definition to understand the reality.
Therefore, human understanding does not depend on your logical definitions.
He used a really grounded example here to prove his point, the bread example. Let's say I want to teach someone what bread is. If I use Aristotelian logic, I have to give them a complex, multi-term logical definition involving the essence of baked grain, water, and heat.
Right. Highly academic breakdown.
Ibn Taymiyyah says if they don't know what bread is, that verbal definition won't help them identify it in a kitchen. We know things by differentiating them through our senses, sight, taste, smell, touch, not by defining them in a vacuum.
I know bread because I ate it, not because I memorized the genus and differentia.
Exactly. This represents a massive epistemological shift. The philosophers believed knowledge trickled down from abstract, perfect definitions in the mind to physical reality.
And Ibn Taymiyyah flips it entirely. He's saying knowledge comes from observable reality and sensory differentiation, moving upwards.
He champions common sense over abstract theory, and he brings that exact same energy to the second pillar of Aristotle's system, the syllogism.
Syllogism is a structured way of reaching a conclusion using multiple premises. It's deductive reasoning. The most famous classic example is...
Oh, Socrates, right.
Yes. Major premise. All men are mortal. Minor premise. Socrates is a man. Conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The logicians claimed you absolutely need this multi-step, roundabout process to guarantee you have reached a true judgment.
Ibn Taymiyyah argues this is a completely artificial way of thinking. He says, look at how the Prophet actually taught people. He gives the example of wine and intoxicants.
That's a great example.
The Prophet said, every intoxicating thing is wine, and all kinds of wine are unlawful. Ibn Taymiyyah points out that a Muslim does not need to sit down with a chalkboard and construct a convoluted major and minor premise to figure out if a newly discovered type of intoxicant is unlawful.
If you possess the knowledge that every intoxicant is forbidden, and you encounter a substance that intoxicates, your mind immediately leaps to the conclusion that it is forbidden.
It's instantaneous.
You don't need the formal mental gymnastics of a syllogism. He argued that syllogisms don't actually give you any new knowledge about the real world. They just tediously rearrange what you already inherently know.
I am going to push back here on behalf of the philosophers. Isn't basic reasoning a good thing? Like, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. What is the harm in being methodical?
You mean, why throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Yeah, logic is just a neutral tool, like a hammer.
That is the modern assumption.
Yeah.
But Ibn Taymiyyah saw it very differently. He believed that Aristotelian logic was not a neutral tool. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it carried massive metaphysical baggage.
What kind of baggage?
He argued that Aristotelian logic was essentially a geometrical model that was being artificially forced onto the physical and intellectual world. Logicians are manipulating terms the way mathematicians manipulate triangles and circles.
Trying to make everything perfectly neat.
Right. Trying to transfer a rigid mathematical framework onto living, breathing, messy realities.
In geometry, things are perfect. A triangle is a perfect, abstract concept that always equals 180 degrees. But reality is chaotic. People aren't triangles.
Exactly. The philosophers were claiming that the ultimate perfection of the human soul comes from understanding these simple universals, these abstract, perfect concepts like absolute humanity or absolute motion that don't even exist in the physical world.
Ibn Taymiyyah said this pursuit is entirely useless. These universal concepts only exist in your imagination. Spending your life contemplating them does not elevate your soul or improve your society.
So if contemplating perfect abstract definitions doesn't elevate the soul, what does?
Knowledge combined with virtuous action.
Action is the critical missing piece in the philosopher's worldview. To Ibn Taymiyyah, faith, or iman, isn't just mentally acknowledging that God exists, as some sects believed. It's knowing God and actively serving God through your deeds. If your philosophical system doesn't lead to practical action, if it just leaves you contemplating abstract universals in your head while the Mongols conquer your city.
It is a catastrophic failure.
Completely.
That is such a refreshing take. He is basically telling the elite academics of his day to log off and touch grass. Get out of your own head and look at the real world.
It really was.
And he carries this exact same attitude into his teardown of Greek physics. Having dismantled their logic, he moves on to how they viewed the physical universe, which they used as the basis to explain God.
This brings us to the fascinating territory of physics, atoms, and the pig in the salt mine.
I love this part. Okay, so the physical theories of the scholastic theologians, the Jamites, Mutazilites, and Asherites, were heavily dependent on an adapted version of the Greek theory of the atom.
They believed that all physical bodies in the universe are made up of indivisible, indestructible atoms. They argued that God creates these foundational atoms ex nihilo, out of nothing, and once they are brought into existence, they are never destroyed.
Okay, so their view of reality is that everything is made of indestructible Lego bricks.
Yes.
The bricks themselves never change their nature, you just rearrange them or paint them different colors. The paint and the arrangement are what they called the accidents.
That is a perfect analogy. The atoms are the eternal substance. Everything else is a temporary accident attached to them by God.
But Ibn Taymiyyah rejected this entirely. He said this theory of the indivisible, indestructible atom was a baseless innovation.
He argued that the early Arabs, the companions of the Prophet, could never have conceived of an indivisible atom without dimension.
It's an oxymoron to them.
He considered it a meaningless, equivocal term. He challenged them, how can you have a physical thing that exists in reality but has no spatial dimensions?
It's another mental abstraction being treated as physical reality. But the philosophers took this Lego theory and ran with it, leading to a concept called the theory of the similarity of bodies.
Yes.
They claimed that because absolutely everything is made of the exact same indestructible atoms, all matter in the universe is basically the exact same stuff.
So the only difference between a rock, a tree, and a human being is the accidents, the temporary qualities currently attached to those atoms.
And this theoretical rabbit hole led to a really bizarre, famous theological riddle about bodily resurrection.
The riddle of the fish.
I am so glad we are talking about the fish riddle.
This shows the absurdity of their system perfectly. The philosophers who believed that human bodies were just temporary assemblies of indestructible atoms had a real problem explaining the physical resurrection of the dead on Judgment Day.
Okay, set up the riddle for us.
They posed a scenario. What happens if a man dies at sea and his physical body is eaten by a large fish?
Okay, tracking so far. Fish eats man.
And then that specific fish is caught by fishermen and eaten by a second man.
Oh boy.
Now, the indestructible atoms that originally belonged to the first man's body are physically incorporated into the second man's body.
Because they can't be destroyed.
Right. So on the day of resurrection, when God reconstructs the physical bodies, who gets those shared atoms, the first man or the second man? They can't both have them.
That is what happens when you take a theoretical model and stretch it until it snaps. It is frankly hilarious.
It really is.
It reminds me of modern people trying to explain human emotions, consciousness, or love purely through the lens of quantum physics or string theory. It's using completely the wrong set of tools for the job. How did the philosophers even try to answer that fish riddle?
It caused endless debates. Some of them tried to argue that there are certain invisible, essential parts of the human body that can never be dissolved or digested by the fish.
Wait, really? Magic body parts?
Basically. And so those specific parts supposedly don't transfer to the second man. It was a desperate, convoluted attempt to save their atomic theory from its own logical conclusions.
Ibn Taymiyyah just rolls his eyes at all of this. He says, look around. Bodies do completely change their identity. Matter isn't just static Lego bricks.
He points to observable reality and common sense, bringing up a famous ruling from Islamic jurists, the pig in the salt mine.
This is a masterclass in his practical, grounded methodology.
In Islamic law, consuming the flesh of a pig is strictly forbidden. It is fundamentally impure. But jurists had debated a highly specific scenario.
What happens if a pig falls into a massive salt mine, dies, and over a long period of time, its body completely dissolves and chemically transforms into salt?
The jurists agreed that once it is completely fundamentally turned into salt, it becomes pure and lawful to eat. Why? Because it's not a pig anymore. It's salt.
The essence changed.
Yes. Ibn Taymiyyah uses this legal consensus to destroy the philosopher's atomic theory. He says the essence of the thing has changed, not just the temporary accidents.
The body lost its identity completely and became an entirely different substance.
Things in the physical world are dissimilar. They transform. They change their core nature. You don't need invisible, indestructible atoms to explain reality. You just need to observe the world as it actually behaves.
He also tackled how they used this flawed physics to interpret the Qur'an. There's the story of the prophet Abraham looking at the stars, the moon, and the sun, and realizing they aren't gods.
Right. The philosophers tried to claim Abraham realized this because of the concept of motion and shift, arguing that movement is the ultimate philosophical proof that a body is originated and therefore cannot be the eternal God.
The philosophers were entirely obsessed with motion as the defining characteristic of created things, linking back to Aristotle's unmoved mover.
But Ibn Taymiyyah pointed out that the Arabic word used in the Quran regarding Abraham's realization, upheaval, just means setting or disappearing from sight.
Abraham didn't use complex Greek physics about local motion to reject the stars.
Exactly. If Abraham was rejecting them simply because they moved, he would have rejected them the second he saw them in the night sky because stars are constantly moving across the sky.
Abraham rejected them because they set, they disappeared, they were covered by veils of darkness and daylight. He relied on simple, observable reality, the fact that these celestial bodies are subject to change and disappearance.
Not an abstract theory of motion. Ibn Taymiyyah is constantly trying to pull the scholars back down to earth, away from the chalkboard and into reality.
Pulling them back down to earth was crucial because this obsession with abstract theory was leading to what Ibn Taymiyyah considered the absolute most dangerous heresy of all.
This brings us to his ultimate battle, fighting the pantheists.
Yes, the pantheists. This is where all of Ibn Taymiyyah's arguments against Greek logic and physics culminate in one massive conflict.
Pantheism, in this specific historical context, was the complete blurring of the boundary between the creator and the created world. And the prime target for his anger here was the immensely influential Sufi thinker, Ibn Arabi.
Ibn Arabi preached a mystical concept called the unity of existence, Wahdat al-Wujud. What does that actually mean in practice?
It is a deeply complex mystical framework. But broadly speaking, it is the idea that existence is one single unified reality.
Okay, one existence.
To Ibn Arabi and his followers, there aren't two separate, distinct existences, meaning God's existence on one hand and the created world's existence on the other. There's only one existence.
Therefore, the existence of the created world is actually just the very existence of God himself, manifesting in different physical and spiritual forms.
So to oversimplify, everything is God, and God is everything.
Ibn Arabi went so far as to argue that even in a state of non-existence, before things are physically created in the world, they have a sort of positive reality waiting in the void.
And the act of creation is just these latent things uniting with God's existence.
Ibn Taymiyyah absolutely loses his mind over this concept. He calls it a pharaonic theory. The text notes he pointed out that even Christians, Jews, and polytheists didn't believe something so utterly absurd.
He was furious.
Why did he view this specific theory as so uniquely dangerous?
It goes straight to the nature of God as a creator with a will. Ibn Taymiyyah argued that if you critically analyze Ibn Arabi's theory, it actually does two highly destructive things.
What are they?
It secretly denies the existence of God as an independent sovereign being, and it denies God's role as a creator. If absolutely everything is just a manifestation of one single existence, then God isn't creating anything new. God is just putting on different masks.
To Ibn Taymiyyah, there must be an impenetrable boundary. The creator is the creator, and the created is the created. They cannot be fused.
He quoted the early Sufi master Junaid al-Baghdadi, who said, "To believe in the unity of God is to separate the quality of origination from that of eternity."
He also directed this same fury at the philosophical concept of the necessary cause. Some philosophers tried to explain God not as a supreme being with a will, but as a necessary cause that just automatically, eternally emanates the universe.
Like the sun naturally emanates light.
Right. It has no choice, no volition, no conscious power. It just is.
Ibn Taymiyyah says a cause without will or power is functionally meaningless. How can a being with no will, choice, or conscious design create this incredibly complex, ordered universe?
He pointed out the blatant contradictions in their own logic. He said the philosophers confuse different attributes. They theorize that knowledge is the exact same thing as the knower, and power is the exact same thing as the powerful.
But we know from basic human reality that having knowledge isn't the same thing as having willpower. A God who just exists as a passive, necessary cause isn't a God you can pray to, and it isn't a God who actively intervenes in the course of human history.
It strips away all personal relationship and all accountability. And that leads to another philosophical concept he hated, the namus.
Yes, the namus. This was a philosophical idea, famously held by towering figures like Ibn Sina. You might know him as Avicenna.
Right, Avicenna.
Essentially reduced religion to mere social utility. The philosophers argued that the world needs to be governed by wise men to maintain order and avoid societal collapse.
So they viewed prophets not as divine messengers, but as just extremely wise philosophers who brought the namus, the revealed religious laws, simply as civil, domestic, and moral codes designed to keep the uneducated masses in line.
So religion isn't ultimate divine truth, it's just a useful tool for social engineering.
The rituals, the prayers, the dietary laws, they are just moral guardrails to keep people well-behaved.
Ibn Sina and his followers believed that philosophers were actually on a higher intellectual plane than the prophets, or at least equal to them.
Because the philosophers understood the abstract truths behind these practical laws, whereas the masses just followed the laws blindly.
Right. They believed in a concept of common revelation, wahi al-mushtarak, that was available to philosophers through intellect, not just to prophets through angelic intervention.
Now, this is an interesting nuance. The sources show that Ibn Taymiyyah actually agreed that there is a form of common revelation, like true dreams, available to ordinary people.
Yes, he wasn't completely against the concept.
He accepted the standard forms of revelation to the prophet, such as in a waking state, in dreams, from behind a veil, or through an angel, but he also recognized this fourth type. He derived this from the Qur'an and a saying of Ubaga ibn Samit, affirming that God speaks to servants in dreams.
But he strictly drew a line when it came to including the Greek philosophers in this category.
He emphatically denied that Aristotle had any share whatsoever in this common revelation or prophecy. Why? Because Aristotle believed the heavens were eternal.
He didn't even know they were created by a higher power. Ibn Taymiyyah called Aristotle the most ignorant of men regarding God, even if he was well-versed in physics and natural sciences.
He pointed out that these Greek philosophers were essentially planet worshippers who didn't even know about the historical prophets like Abraham or Moses. Why should Islamic scholars treat them as spiritual guides?
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? Let's tie all of these threads together. Why does Ibn Taymiyyah care so passionately about this boundary between creator and creation? Why is it the hill he is willing to literally die on in a dungeon with his charcoal?
This raises an important question, and the answer is, it is entirely about moral accountability and action. If everything is God, as the pantheists claim, or if religion is just a social construct for the masses, as the philosophers claim, then there is no objective moral law.
There is no real ultimate difference between good and evil, between the oppressed and the oppressor.
If everything is just a manifestation of God, then the Mongol invader burning down your city is God, and you fighting back is God.
It neuters your ability to act with moral clarity. It destroys your motivation to fight for justice.
It leads directly to fatalism and passivity. And remember, Ibn Taymiyyah's entire worldview was forged in a time of apocalyptic crisis that demanded immediate, courageous action.
His core belief is that faith is knowledge plus virtuous action.
If your philosophy blurs the lines of reality so much that you cannot tell the difference between the creator and the creation, or right and wrong, then your philosophy is not just flawed, it is an active threat to the survival of the community.
Wow, that brings it all full circle. The man who fought the Mongols on the battlefield was fighting the exact same war in his treatises.
He was fighting for clarity, for boundaries, and for the ability to take decisive, moral action in the real world.
He was trying to clear away a massive intellectual fog. He saw all these imported Greek systems, the logic, the physics, the metaphysics, as a dense fog that was blinding his people to the simple practical truths of their faith and the urgent realities of their world.
Let's summarize this incredible journey. We started with a 7-year-old boy fleeing the destruction of his home during the Mongol invasion.
We saw him grow into a scholar who refused to stay safely in the ivory tower, a man who led armies and debated the greatest minds of his time.
He recognized that the internal theoretical divisions of his society were a fatal weakness, so he went after the root cause, the obsession with abstract, imported theory.
He systematically dismantled the theological establishment of his day. He refused to let Greek logic force God into neat mathematical boxes, famously standing his ground in the middle, refusing both the total erasure of God's attributes and the anthropomorphic comparison to human bodies.
He insisted on reading the text bila kaif, without asking how.
He exposed the deep flaws in Aristotelian definitions and syllogisms, showing how they lead to endless chains of semantics instead of real, actionable knowledge.
He used the common sense of a pig turning into salt to defeat the unbreakable atoms of the physicist.
And finally, he fiercely defended the absolute boundary between the creator and the creation against the pantheists, demanding a worldview that required accountability and action rather than passive mysticism.
He was, without a doubt, one of the most independent and uncompromising thinkers in history. A man who proved that you can tear down an entire intellectual edifice with nothing but pieces of charcoal and an unbreakable will.
He is the ultimate historical reminder that intellectual systems, no matter how prestigious, ancient, or complicated they are, should never overcomplicate common sense or get in the way of practical action.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Ibn Taymiyyah spent his entire life fighting against scholars who forced reality to fit into their complex, imported theoretical frameworks, specifically Greek logic and metaphysics.
When the human reality didn't match their theory, they twisted reality, coming up with ridiculous riddles about fish or denying that God has a will.
They trusted their system more than their own eyes. Today, we live in a world that is increasingly governed by our own imported theoretical frameworks. Not Greek logic, but algorithmic systems, predictive data models, economic theories, and artificial intelligence architectures.
We constantly force human behavior, society, and reality to fit into these digital and mathematical models.
And when human nature doesn't fit the model, we often blame the humans, not the model.
We prioritize the algorithm over the lived experience.
So, the question to explore on your own is this. If Ibn Taymiyyah were sitting in a prison cell today looking out at our world, what modern, unquestionable systems of logic, economics, or data would he be dismantling with his charcoal?
What are the algorithms of our time that are blinding us to common sense? That is a fantastic question to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the fiercely independent mind of Ibn Taymiyyah. Keep questioning the systems around you, trust your common sense, and we will see you on the next deep dive.